Well, welcome to my channel. Today we have a special guest for this particular topic. As you can see, we will be talking about education, and we'll be talking about education with Dr. George Grant. And so I think it's only wise that I give a introduction of who George Grant is. Dr. Grant, for me, I was first exposed to him on the Canon app. I was watching his modernity series, and it was an edifying series for me, just learning so much about history and what's happened from the time of Christ all the way up until now, and then from that point, I got introduced to his humanities curriculum, which I would say is the best curriculum that I've seen thus far. He's also the founder of Franklin Classical School in Tennessee. He's the founder of King's Meadow Study Center. He's authored several books on politics, literature, and history. He's done a tremendous amount of work on behalf of the homeless, along with doing projects to promote the sanctity of life. He's a husband, father, grandfather. He's the pastor of Parish Presbyterian Church, and I would say that Dr. Grant is one of the greatest, has one of the greatest academic minds in our age and in our time. So I hope I hit everything, Dr. Grant.
Well, thank you. It's great delight to be with you, and we haven't
Yeah,
talked in a while, so it's
yeah,
great to see you again.
yeah. Likewise. So, well, before we begin, I would like to hear a little bit about the 1916 project. I did order the book, and I'm waiting for the DVD to come to me. So, what can you share about that?
Yeah, the 1916 project is a project of the White Rose Resistance. It is a pro-life ministry begun by Seth Gruber, a really remarkable, gifted young pro-life hero who has just a great ministry. I have wanted to make a film about Margaret Sanger, the
Mm,
founder of Planned Parenthood, and all of her connections intellectually from around the time of the First World War all the way up through the 1960s. And Seth read two of my books that really detailed Margaret Sanger's history. He felt like this was really an important project. 1916 was the year that she established an illegal birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New
wow.
York. And obviously, there's a bit of a play on the 1619 project.
Hmm.
The idea behind this is that the real tragedy of American history um, can be told through many, many different lenses, but we really need to see 1916 as this pivot point where suddenly a whole view of the family, of women, of childbearing, of the value of children, the sanctity of life, all dramatically change from that point to the present. So the film is documentary. It's really well done. It's we have just begun the process of the final filming for a sequel called The Last Stand, which is based on
Mm,
my book Third Time Around. So we Third Time Around takes the story, the pro-life story, which is really the gospel story,
mhm.
from the first century all the way to the present. We in a film you can't do all of that, so we focus on three major episodes. So we start in Rome with the early church, then we move to Paris
Okay.
with the French Revolution, and then we wind up in England with William Wilberforce
Mm,
and his struggle to end chattel slavery as well as transform the morals of the nation. So I'm really excited about that. It's going to be a much more beautiful film just because it's Rome, Paris, London, Oxford. It's just going to be gorgeous, but really powerful. I think folks are going to really. A lot of schools are now doing screenings of the
Yeah.
1916 project, and I think we'll see the same thing with The Last Stand.
Okay. Is there any tie-ins with the 1916 project and feminism, like this first or second wave of feminism?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Everything
Okay.
from Darwinian uh, and eugenics, evolutionary thought, to the founding of Playboy magazine, Kinsey, the first wave feminism, second wave feminism, all of that is sort of quickly wrapped up. I mean, you get everything from the KKK to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis,
Hmm.
all wound up in this one worldview. And so it's really powerful.
Wow. Oh, good. Yeah, I can't wait to read through the book and watch the documentary, well,
Good.
both of them. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, Dr. Grant, how would you define education in your own words?
Well, education is obviously the transfer of knowledge, information, and hopefully wisdom from one generation to the next. So, in a sense, when you talk about education, you're inescapably talking about discipleship, mentorship. And regardless of what your worldview is, in a sense, all education is covenantal succession. It's
Mm,
passing on values and principles of one generation to the next generation. That can be either good or ill. T.S. Eliot argued that all education is at its heart religious.
mm,
So the question is, what's your religion? If your religion is man-centered, secular, and neo-Marxist, then education is going to look one way. If you're a Christian and rooted in the rich inheritance of the church through the ages, then education is going to look dramatically different. And so education is at heart a process of discipleship.
So, t two things. Number one, when you say religious, what do you mean by that? And then number two, when you say discipleship, what do you mean by discipleship?
Yeah, so religion is, as Paul Tillich, the theologian, said, your ultimate concern or your
Mm-hmm.
ultimate values. So there
Mm-hmm.
are atheists, but
Mm-hmm.
that's their religion.
Mm,
There are people who have a broadly secular perspective. They might believe in a God, but their values are rooted in materialism and consumerism. That's their religion. So
mm-hmm.
religion is really what we find our ultimate value in.
Mm,
For
mm-hmm.
Christians, obviously, our perspective is shaped by a sovereign God and a Redeemer, the Lord Jesus
Mm-hmm.
Christ.
Yeah, yeah.
And that shapes everything. And
Mm-hmm.
it shapes everything in a dramatically different way. We teach math differently, we
Mm-hmm.
teach physics differently, we teach literature differently because of the ground upon which we build.
Mm,
We are, in a sense, in a kind of revolution against the secularist worldview
yep.
when we hold to biblical principles. Now, whether we act in accord with that or not is the big question. And
Mm-hmm.
for much of the last 100 years, Christians have not acted as if there is a God and that he is sovereign. And the result is that we have produced a rather godless form of education.
Mm, mm. And then what about discipleship?
So discipleship is simply a person of one generation passing on to the next generation those essential values and the
Hmm.
worldview grid that is necessary to live out those values in the midst of a fallen world. So
Mm,
it's a kind of mentoring, but a deliberate mentoring to reproduce in the young person what needs to be formed in them for morals, for values, and for rightly thinking about the world.
good, good. So, I mean, what state, um, well, let me ask it in a better way. What is the state of education in 2025? And I know that's, I mean, because you have Christian education, you have classical Christian education, you have government education, public schooling. I mean, what would you say specifically when it comes to government education and public schools? What's the state of it currently?
Well, one of the ways that you can evaluate the state of education is simply to look at the end result.
Mm,
Currently in the United States, about 56% of Americans are technically illiterate, meaning
mm,
they can read, but they don't.
mm-hmm.
Only about 2% of, uh, of Americans actually read more than 3 books in a year.
Wow.
Only about 2%. So we're looking at a whole generation that has essentially been weaned away from all of the things that built our civilization in the first place. In our
Mm-hmm.
cities, it's particularly dire. In our
Mm-hmm.
inner cities, our urban areas, what we're seeing are whole generations of children who are living in fatherless homes
Mm-hmm.
where education is basically life management rather than life enhancement. So it's behavioral modification rather than actually filling them with curiosity and imagination and desire to grow and to learn and
Mm-hmm.
given the tools to actually grow and learn. So we're in a sense creating a servile type culture, and it cuts across all races, all creeds, but it is particularly dire. 40 years ago, a whole generation ago, the Department of Education, which then was a brand new department
Mm-hmm.
in government. It was actually created by Jimmy Carter just before he left following his defeat by Ronald Reagan. So,
Mm-hmm.
under Ronald Reagan, the new Department of Education issued a report, and it was called A Nation at Risk. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that it said was in the introduction, if a foreign nation wanted to destroy the United States, they could not have come up with a better strategy than what our public school education has become.
Wow.
Another remarkable thing to keep in mind is that 100 years ago, uh, the educational bureaucracy, in other words, administrators and staffs,
Mm-hmm.
compared to actual classroom teachers, uh, approximately 1% of all educators were not in the classroom. They were in an office somewhere, they were administrators or whatever. Today, 42% of all of those who are in education are not teachers. So, in other words, we've added this huge layer of bureaucracy. Many of them are federal bureaucrats in
Mm-hmm.
Washington, D.C., who have no connection whatsoever to a classroom. They're not involved with the lives of children.
Mm-hmm.
Instead,
Mm-hmm.
they are managing budgets and creating ideological standards that are then
Yeah.
imposed on our classroom teachers. So
Mm.
the state of education in America today is in dire straits, which is why I think the resurgence of things like homeschooling, classical Christian education, um, supplemental afternoon education in our
Hmm.
urban areas, why that's so important and can have a huge impact.
Wow. So, couple things. Number one, you use the term servile, and it makes me think of um, uh, education that was, in a sense, for slaves back in the times of Aristotle and Plato. Is there any correlation between that type of education then compared to what's going on now?
Yeah, and I'm not implying slavery as much
Right.
as, in a sense, the bondage of the mind and the
Yeah.
bondage of the imagination. We're
Yeah.
creating people that, by educational standards, they're trying to manage their behavior,
Yeah.
not, enable their lives and their imaginations to flourish, which
Right.
means that they will always be dependent on government
Yeah.
programs and government
Right.
standards, and that they have much less of an opportunity to actually become incredibly productive and prosperous in life. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I remember we helped to start here in town in Franklin, Tennessee, a school for underprivileged children
Hmm. Hmm.
in an urban sort of area. And we did interviews with a number of the kids about what their aspirations were for the future. And
Hmm.
this one young man who's in the second grade said that what he wanted to be when he grew up was either a pro basketball player or a pro football player, which
Hmm.
is a fine aspiration. This is a little boy, though, and very few people make it into the NFL or into the NBA. And so
Right. Right.
the woman who was doing the interview said, "Well, Jacques, if you can't be a pro football player, what else would you want to be when you grow up?" And he
Hmm.
said, "Well, I guess I could work at McDonald's."
Mm. Wow.
So, in other words,
Wow.
the vision of this child had been stunted to the
Yeah.
place where he was truly servile. There was no broad horizon, there was no big dream. And one of the things that we've got to do in education is to create that fire in the belly of every child to dream, to aspire, to
Hmm.
have creative imaginations and the foundations to become productive
Hmm.
and prosperous in their lives.
Good.
And that's
Good.
one
Yeah.
of the things that great education can do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like the term that you use, bondage, because it's either, I guess, one, being in bondage, or two, having liberty and or freedom, right?
Right.
And so the other thought I had too was the Department of Education. What's your thoughts in relation to, I looked at a statistic the other day that stated that the reading and math scores when the of Education first came out compared to now, there's been no improvement. They're virtually the same. And so, what's your thoughts on it being diminished? To a certain degree.
Yeah, I really believe that parents
Mm-hmm.
and local communities should be the first and most powerful voice in education. And so I'm never in favor of centralizing authority and power for things like education in
Mm-hmm.
Washington, D.C., or even in state capitals. I
Right.
think
Right.
parents and local communities need to be responsible for that. The Bible
Mm-hmm.
makes it plain that the responsibility for education is not the responsibility of the state, And it's not the
Right.
responsibility of the church, it's the responsibility of parents.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so we need to make sure that everything that we do in education reinforces that first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, because we've created these huge bureaucracies, a tremendous amount of money goes into anything and everything except actual classroom instruction. We spend all this money. If you've seen the Department of Education's building blocks in Washington D.C. across 3 blocks of central Washington D.C., these massive buildings, and you think, my goodness, the amount of money that we spend, and
Yeah.
it's essentially fruitless. We've not been able to produce
Mm-hmm.
real good, solid results from all of that money that we've spent. And so it's if this were a business, it would have gone bankrupt 2 decades ago.
Right, right. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So, how would you define? Well, let me give a bit of some introduction to this question. The other day, I was listening to uh, a lecture from you, and you was speaking in the lecture about the fact that government schools um, failed you, and I would agree with that. It's failed me, but it's failed all of us, and so, how would you define um, public education, modern education, progressive education? Like, how would you define it?
Well, I think there are multiple aspects. First, let me just say there are a lot of really good, dear, and committed educators who are still in the public system.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah,
anything and everything that I say is not intended to be derogatory toward them.
I understand. Mm-hmm.
Secondly, there are varieties of experience in public education in various places in the United States. But because of the ideology, meaning
Mm-hmm.
the imposed philosophy
Mm-hmm.
of education coming from progressive leftists in Washington, you have all of this pressure on local school districts to conform. And the carrot, of course, behind this stick is federal dollars.
Yep.
Um, so, one of the things that has happened is that we've seen a top down transfer of authority in education,
Mm-hmm.
almost shaped like a pyramid and with
Mm-hmm.
as much pagan ideas as a pyramid. Um,
Mm.
Secondly, besides the ideology, what we have seen in the last 10 years is a radical agenda of socialization to
Mm.
change attitudes toward human sexuality, to change attitudes toward gender, to change attitudes in our students to a whole variety of social causes that
Mm-hmm.
parents may or may not agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And yet this is imposed. We don't have an option, and there's no way out in most cases. So
Mm-hmm.
it is a forcible kind of re-education program that is going on to change the social mores of our children and obviously of our civilization and its future.
Mm.
These progressive ideas have very little to do with things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. They don't teach children history. They don't teach them the great works of literature. Instead, it's a kind of indoctrination.
Yeah.
And we spend a lot of the school day on anything and everything except matters of true education in
Yeah.
many of our
Yeah.
schools. This is particularly true in urban schools, where again, a lot of the effort of the teacher is simply crowd control, it's behavioral modification. And so it, uh, you just don't have a whole lot of real education taking place.
Yeah. Yeah. I laugh because you're 100% right, And so it's a lot of management, behavior modification, and then it's a lot of times where you're trying to really teach morals and you're trying to teach virtue, but it can be very challenging to hit that, in the classroom, and school
Right.
wide as well. So,
Right.
um, yeah. How would you define Christian education?
Well, Christian education is an attempt to go back to those basic educational standards and do it with a moral foundation,
Mm-hmm.
an attempt to inculcate virtue.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, it is moralism rather than actual virtue.
Mm.
Unfortunately, that's an indictment of the modern church, not so much of Christian education, but
Mm-hmm.
we basically teach as if we were a public school from the 1950s
Mm-hmm.
with a few Bible verses tacked on.
Right.
That's typical, Christian day school education. It's
Yeah.
vastly superior to public education,
Mm-hmm.
but it is, in my view, still deficient
Mm-hmm.
in its shallowness,
Okay.
which
Okay.
brings us to classical Christian education,
Yeah.
which attempts to do much, much more by grounding a student in the rich, rich inheritance of the past,
Mm-hmm.
all of the art, music, literature, ideas, science, technology that
Mm-hmm.
built Western civilization, and understanding it from a Christian worldview perspective,
Mm-hmm.
which means that we look at these things, we don't look at them uncritically, but we look at them in terms of the human flourishing that occurs when we live out the standards in accord with the scriptures.
Mm. So, when it comes to classical Christian education, what would you say makes a classical Christian school truly classical Christian in its fabric, in its makeup, and in its identity? You
Well,
know.
that's a great question, and it's one that I've had to ask myself a great deal as I have attempted to help schools start in places
Hmm.
like the Muslim Middle East, uh,
Hmm.
in Indonesia. We've got schools in Iraq. We've got schools
Hmm.
in Egypt, in North Africa, and one of the things that we have to do when we're moving to a very different kind of culture, like in Jakarta, Indonesia,
Hmm.
the classical languages have very little to do with them. They're not thinking in terms of Latin, Greek,
Yeah.
and Hebrew. Greek and Hebrew, perhaps as biblical languages, but Latin is not the root of any of the languages
Yeah. Yeah.
in Indonesia. Um, but so we have to really rethink what are the fundamentals. And the
Hmm.
fundamentals really derive from biblical principles,
Hmm.
from the creation ordinances of Genesis 1 and 2, how God intended the world to be built, uh,
Hmm.
and and then mining the riches of our Christian inheritance in
Hmm.
art, music, literature, and ideas, and giving our students good introductions and good exposure to that richness so that they can see where we've been, how
Hmm.
we've gotten to where we are, and where we need to go into the future. So
Mm.
it's classical Christian education here in the United States has a number of distinctives that
Hmm.
might look really different in our schools in, say, Sulaymaniyah in northern Iraq, or in
Right.
Alexandria in Egypt, or in Jakarta in Indonesia. But the
Yeah.
principles are the same. We want to
Okay.
teach children how to think.
Mm.
We want to teach children how to dream and imagine. We want to
Mm-hmm.
spark their imagination through great literature. And we want to give them the tools in order to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Classical Christian education kind of follows that book of Proverbs development from
Mm,
grammar to logic to rhetoric. Um,
mm,
in the book of Proverbs, it's knowledge to understanding to wisdom.
that's
And
good.
so knowledge requires a good bit of memorization. Knowledge is your ABCs, your multiplication tables, basic grammar, and all of that. Understanding is when you're able to put all of that together a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and you start to understand how, um, say, the alphabet and basic
Mm-hmm.
grammar can create sentences and ideas. But wisdom is our goal. So we
Mm,
move from grammar to all the way through logic to the rhetoric stage, the
yeah.
wisdom stage, and that's where a student is able to work skillfully with those tools and begin as a co-regent with
Mm.
other believers, as a sub-creator, to begin to create things that are good and true and beautiful.
Wow, that's good. That's good. So, you stated that, I mean, you deal with a lot of you deal with a lot of classical Christian schools, and you started Franklin Classical School. Talk to us about some of the beginning stages to get the school to where it's at now, you know.
Well, 35 years ago, there was no classical Christian school movement. So we were pioneering.
Yeah,
And honestly, we didn't know what we didn't know.
yeah,
We had, we were literally flying by the seat of our pants, but we knew that we wanted something more for our children. We wanted to recover what people like J.R.R. Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis, what they had in generations before. We wanted what people like William Wilberforce and Thomas Chalmers had.
yeah.
And so we knew that it would involve great books. We knew that it would involve a Christian worldview approach to history. Uh, we weren't real sure what else it might involve. Language
Yeah.
is a really important part of classical Christian education, understanding how language works, where words come from. And so things like Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, um, even if, what we oftentimes would call our biblical languages class uh, kitchen Greek. In other words, we're just introducing a little bit of vocabulary. We're not trying to teach a student how
Right,
to translate the Gospel of John. We're
right.
trying to get them familiar with how Greek has shaped English
Mm-hmm.
and why that makes a difference. So, in those earliest days, we basically had a handful of homeschool families who realized they
Mm-hmm.
wanted something more. And so we
Mm,
created Franklin Classical School as a kind of homeschool co op at first. And eventually we began to add supplemental classes. By the third year, it was pretty much a full scale school. So,
mm-hmm.
by it was 35 years ago that we started this. So it's been quite the journey.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I will say that, I mean, it's a phenomenal classical school, and congrats on the new building on its way.
Well, yeah, keep praying for that. We're not all the way there yet, but it's looking really positive. It could
Yeah,
be a great resource for us. But the
yeah.
good news is, we're going to keep doing what we do, just simply
Mm-hmm.
because God's called us to it, even if we have to meet in somebody's garage. We're just going to keep. We believe in this calling, and we believe it for our children. My grandchildren are now in our school, and so
Yeah,
it's a huge blessing.
yeah. You know, I was telling my wife the other day, and maybe you can speaking to this, before the early 1900s and the late 1800s, education was just education. And then the progressive movement came in regard to transforming
Mhm.
education to what we see now. And now the name of it is classical education. But prior to that movement, it was just education. I mean, I think
Correct.
about Martin Luther. I think about even going back to Augustine and Justin Martyr, and I mean going back to Aristotle and Socrates and Plato. Like this was the way of educating for around 2,400 years, and it's crazy how like I never knew that until the past few years. Like, why am I now discovering the fact that the way we've been educating for the last 100 years is fairly new compared to education for the past 2,000 years, you know?
Right. You know,
Yeah.
one of the things that is haunting to me is our public libraries are
Hmm.
constantly purging books. And what books are they purging? They're purging all of the great old books.
Yeah.
Um, in a sense, we saw the same process in the public schools. What
Yeah.
did the public schools get rid of? Well, they got rid of all of the memory of all of the things that made the public school in the first place possible. So,
Right.
in a sense, you're undermining your own foundations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And much of what we're seeing in modern America is the elimination of all of those things that made America uh, a place where we could have a true experiment in liberty.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've never done it perfectly, but we've done it in a way that the world has never seen anything quite like it before.
Yeah.
And now we're undermining the very foundations that made it possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you say that classical Christian education is for everyone? Um,
Well, yes, but it's a qualified yes. I think that it is the form of education that most closely conforms to biblical standards, and there
mm-hmm.
are a lot of different varieties of classical Christian education. So, there's
Mm-hmm.
sort of the Dorothy Sayers model. There's
Mm-hmm.
the Charlotte Mason model. There's the Circe model. There are a lot of different
Mm-hmm.
approaches, but the idea of substantive, deeply rooted, thoughtful worldview education, that
Mm-hmm.
is for everyone. Not everyone is going to go on to college.
Nope.
Uh, Not everyone should go on to college.
Right.
Lots of people are called to labor with their hands, but classical Christian education is good for all of us. Uh,
Right.
Now, it's a qualified yes, uh, simply because we've not made classical Christian education accessible to the poor. And that's
Mm.
one of the things that I am particularly concerned about is finding ways to make sure that every child who should be classically educated, every parent who wants their child to be classically educated has a way to
Mm-hmm.
do it. So
Mm.
I've created a scholarship program. This summer, the three pastors at our church are going to run 2,025 miles uh, to raise funds for this sponsorship from the first
Wow.
of June to the end of August. We're going to just do this. We call it the uttermost, and
Yeah.
it's bigger than a triathlon. It's bigger than a marathon. We're going to do it all summer long, and
Yeah.
the purpose is to raise those funds because
Yeah.
again, we've not made this incredible way of transforming lives available to the poor, and we need to. We've got to find ways to reach the poor. We also need to find ways to reach those who have learning or physical disabilities.
Mm.
The disability community has been largely excluded from the opportunities that classical Christian education provide. And so if we can begin to create programs that would enable us to embrace all of our brothers
Hmm.
and sisters, that will be a day in which I'll be able to answer that question with an unqualified yes.
Right. Okay. So let me shift it a little bit. Let's speak about parents. To what extent should a parent be involved, excuse me, be involved in their child's education?
As much as is possible.
Mm,
And every
mm,
family's circumstance is a little different. I'm not saying that parents should be meddling. I'm not saying that moms should be helicopter moms,
yeah.
constantly hovering over their child. But parents are given the biblical responsibility to raise up their children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And
Hmm.
so they need to be engaged. Parents need to know what their children are reading.
Hmm.
They need to have times around the dinner table or at night before the child goes to bed, the opportunity to talk about what the child is learning, what they're interested in, what's shaping their soul. And
Hmm.
parents need
Mm,
to be engaged. Parents need to be able to come to the classroom on a regular basis.
hmm.
They need to be able to be involved in whether it's PTA or after school sports or whatever.
Hmm.
Parents need to be involved. That's why I think the volunteer aspect of classical Christian education is so
Hmm.
healthy. So many of our
Mm,
classical Christian schools couldn't operate without our
right.
volunteer moms and dads. And so we need to not only encourage that, we need to build that into the DNA of our educational systems.
Mm. So, with when it comes to educating your children, should Christian parents send their children to public schools?
Not if they can help it, not if there is any other
Hmm.
possible pathway.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
the answer is a pretty unqualified no, but
Yeah.
I also recognize that economic circumstances and
Yeah.
opportunities aren't universally available for
Sure.
families. And so we don't ever want to guilt trip a family because
Yeah.
they don't have other opportunities or choices. Uh, but I really think that any thinking parent is going to wrestle with and try and find a way to ensure that their children are being discipled in a way that is God honoring and soul enhancing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. It makes me think about the fact that um, education shapes the worldview of an image bearer, and putting that child or your children in public education, even as Christians, it makes me think about the fact that from kindergarten to 12th grade, there's an average of 14,000 hours spent um, in schools. And, you know, on a week to week basis, even if I'm having family devotion and or family worship, that child is getting discipled by Caesar, like Vodi would say, Vodi Bakum, for 8 to 10 hours a day, or maybe 7 to 6 hours, 6 to 7 hours a day, you know. And so
Right,
I'm just thinking through. It's almost like a impossible task to a certain degree, you know, to get them
right,
to have a biblical worldview, you know.
right. And there are
Yeah,
some children
yeah.
who are able to emerge unscathed, but
Hmm.
that is rare. It is truly rare.
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
idea that we send our children off as missionaries
Mm-mm.
is a terribly misbegotten idea. Um,
Yeah.
if you're saying that your third grader is a missionary to a 42-year-old committed, secularist who's teaching, in the classroom, I'm sorry, your third grader is not up to the task.
Right. So, so then what would you say to Christian parents who are considering removing their children from public education, you know?
Well, I don't think that there is anything more valuable for us to invest in than our children. I
Yeah.
don't think that any sacrifice uh, is that a parent has to make in order for their children to thrive and flourish. I don't think any sacrifice is foolish, and so
Yeah.
I do understand that to make the choice of private schooling, classical education, or homeschooling, I do understand it is costly and it
Hmm.
is sacrificial. But
Yeah.
this is our children that we're talking about.
Yeah.
We should be willing to do anything and everything that we can
Yeah.
to ensure that our children grow up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And if they're spending those, six, if they child is going to after school programs, 10 hours a day
Hmm.
in a secular environment, that's just unacceptable.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something the other day when I was listening to your lecture about how, um, and you could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but the work you're doing now, or the work that is being done now in a classical Christian school, um, um, is going to affect not necessarily just the students who are in that environment now, but because it's going to be passed down from one generation to the next, your grandkids or individual grandkids are going to be affected positively. Like, is that kind of what you're seeing with the one of the big pluses about classical Christian education? You know?
Yeah, and I've been in this long enough now to begin to see that fruit.
Mm,
We've
mm.
got we've got a number of teachers in our school who were once students in our school. They're
Oh
alumni,
wow,
and they have
that's
come back, and
crazy.
they're teachers. Uh,
Yeah.
we have we have a number of alumni whose
Hmm.
children are now in our school.
Mm.
And so we're already seeing that multi-generational
Yeah.
process. And that is an incredible fruit of a long obedience in the same direction. It's not easy.
Hmm.
You oftentimes don't see it, in the moment. And sometimes it takes 30 years before you can look back and see
Yeah.
all of the fruit that God is bringing forth. But that's what we're called to do. We're called to build for a day that we ourselves may never see.
Yeah. Yeah. What are your thoughts on a classical Christian school adopting a confession of faith? Maybe the Westminster or the Second London Baptist. Like,
Hmm.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that every school already has a confession of faith, whether they have officially adopted one or not.
Hmm.
In the same way that every church has a liturgy, whether they realize they have it or not. There's an
Mm.
order to what they do, and they do that order always.
Yeah.
So every school already has a confession of faith, even if it's not clearly articulated. Which
Hmm.
means that if you want to be intentional, you need to clearly articulate it so that when conflicts arise
Hmm.
or when difficulties arise, you have a standard to go back to.
Hmm.
And so a lot of Christian schools will say, we have no creed but Christ. We have, uh, we hold to the scriptures, and it's sola scriptura. The problem, of course, is that we're constantly summarizing, and the question
Hmm.
is, whose
Hmm.
summary, whose interpretation are you going to follow? So
Hmm.
I always encourage schools to have standards that are
Hmm.
clear. It's just like when you lead a small group Bible study, you need to have expectations. Here's where we're going to start. Here's who's leading, and here's when we're going to end. You need those boundaries so
Hmm.
that you set expectations,
Yeah.
and you solve all kinds of conflict and problems simply by saying this is what we hold to, this is what we believe. So one of
Yeah.
the things that we say at Franklin Classical School is that we hold to the Nicene and Apostle Creeds,
Hmm. Hmm.
and uh, in areas of conflict, we hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Hmm.
And that does not mean that every single person in our school has themselves
Hmm.
subscribed to the Westminster Standards. They just know that this is from the fountain from which the garden will be watered.
That's
This
good. Yeah.
is the fountainhead of the worldview,
Yeah.
and it sets the standard. Our schools in northern Iraq are rooted in the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Yeah.
95% of our students come from Muslim households, uh,
Wow. That's
but they know that their children are going to be taught the gospel and that every single class is rooted in a Christian worldview. And because the education is
wow.
vastly superior to anything else that a student can get in
Yeah.
Erbil, northern Iraq, or Sulaymaniyah, northern Iraq, they send their children to our school. We always ask the parents ahead of time. Now, you do realize, don't you, that this is a Christian school? And they say, yes, yes. You do realize we're going to teach your children about Jesus.
Hmm.
Yes, yes,
Hmm.
yes, yes. It's astonishing.
Yeah. That's
When you
crazy.
have those standards, it sets you free to teach from that biblical worldview perspective.
Good. 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 That's crazy. 95% come from um a Muslim
Non,
household.
yeah, Muslim households.
Wow. What's the
Yeah.
population of that school?
Uh, the school in Sulaymaniyah has 750 students. The school in
Wow.
Erbil has 450 students, and the school in Dahuk has 250 students. So three
Wow.
big schools, and then we have five schools in the refugee camps that are sort of makeshift schools, and one of those in the big refugee camp, refugee camp, where the people were driven out by ISIS. That school runs three platoons. In other words, there's a morning school,
Mm-hmm.
uh, a early afternoon school, and a late afternoon school. Just because we don't have enough classrooms, so we have to
Right.
run a platoon system. Um, and uh,
Wow.
and every single one of those students is either Muslim or Kakai, uh, and so it's really remarkable the opportunity that the Lord has opened up.
Wow. Wow. Well, then you should have an answer to this scenario I'm going to give you. So let me let me give you a scenario, and then I just want your wisdom to speak into it. Let's say there is a Christian school in an urban area. Uh, 99% of the student population comes from an economically disadvantaged background. Majority of the students and their parents do not attend church regularly, and over 90% of the students come from a single parent household. What are some of the things you would want to implement in the beginning stages to move this school um, towards becoming a classical Christian school?
Well, let me tell you the story of one school that we have in the worst slum in Jakarta.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the midst of a swamp that has been developed. There are about 100,000 people who live in this slum. Uh, their houses are built on stilts up above the swamp. There are no roads. you get to every place by boat. Imagine this rabbit warren of makeshift buildings built out of plywood and sheet metal and plastic, just whatever the poorest of the poor can assemble. Uh, in the middle of this slum, we established a classical Christian school.
Hmm.
The students in this classical Christian school, not one single one of them had an intact family. Not
Wow.
one single child. 200 students.
Hmm.
No intact families. 100% of the mothers were involved in human trafficking. They were prostitutes. So we have the children of prostitutes in the poorest section of one of the poorest countries in the world. No streets, no roads, nothing but these ramshackle tin sheds. There are places as you're navigating through the little canals between the buildings where you can't even see the sky. It's 5 stories tall, ramshackle buildings built out of everything from chicken coop material to, garbage scraps. So in this school, what did we attempt to do? Well, we attempted to do what we do in every classical Christian school. We teach them how to read. We teach them how to sing. We teach them the gladness and joy of the gospel. We introduce them to beautiful art and music and literature and ideas. We bring the civilization that they have never seen and never known before. We bring it into their hearts and minds and let them know that this is a world that they can live in, grow in, achieve in. Um, it's sacrificial work. We have to, obviously, we're not getting teachers from the neighborhood. We have to bring
Hmm.
the teachers in from elsewhere. Um, these students have no background. So to give them even school uniforms is this huge leap. They've never seen anything like this before. And it is life transforming. It brings discipline and order and hope. And one of the, I, I've, one of my, the last time I visited the school, um, one of the greatest delights that I had was seeing some of the mothers coming and sitting in the classes. None of them know how to read, uh, and sitting in the classes with their little children, just soaking it in with great delight and great joy.
I don't understand that. I don't understand how um, you're able to build um, a culture within that school the parents, without parent partnership. Because it sounds like, I mean, parent partnership there would be slim to none. Like, I mean, how is that
Well,
feasible? Yeah.
one of the things that happens is that it starts to draw these mothers in. The mothers
Mm,
that were sitting in the classroom, they were realizing this is something that I never had, and my
mm,
child is getting something that I've never seen before. And
mm-hmm,
um, you know, Ben Carson, one of the great heroes of American culture today,
mm-hmm.
served in the first Trump administration,
Yep.
is the progenitor of a whole host of great educational initiatives. He had a single mom growing up
Mm-hmm.
who worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, was relentless in pushing her 2 children to achieve academically. It was only when Ben was a teenager that he figured out that his mother did not know how to read.
Mm,
But
mm,
she was so committed to pushing her children. Of course, Ben not only went on to achieve great things in college, he went on to medical school. He became a renowned surgeon and one of the most articulate, um, and persuasive Christian voices of our day. And it was done in a household where a mom just realized, I've got to give my kids something that I never had. And
That's
sometimes,
encouraging.
sometimes when you start to see some of the, these schools in Muslim areas or in a slum like that, or some of the underprivileged communities where we've started schools here in the U.S., you start to realize this can change a family as much as it can change a child.
Wow, that's good. That's good. So it sounds like what you're saying is whether you're in a Muslim country or whether you're in a rural area or whether you're in the heart of the west side of Chicago or Detroit or St. Louis in the urban area, it can be done. It's just going to take a lot of work and a
It,
lot of diligence.
it takes a lot of
Yeah,
work. It's
yeah,
a long obedience in the same direction. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's hard,
Okay. Yeah,
but anything worth doing is hard.
yeah, yeah, yeah. What are some of the theologians you like? I mean, who are some of the theologians you maybe like listening to? You know.
Well, my one of my greatest heroes is R.C. Sproul, and
Yeah,
he's in heaven
yeah,
now, but
yeah,
I still love to listen to his stuff. Sinclair Ferguson is
yeah,
one of my favorites. John MacArthur, who's great hero of the faith. He's in very ill health now,
yeah. He is.
and I don't know how long we're going to have him. Al Mohler is
Yeah,
someone that I really appreciate and I love. We've had a number of times where he and I have had good conversations. I just so deeply appreciate him. And one of
yeah,
the guys that I listened to a lot in my early Christian life was Chuck Swindoll. He's
yeah. Yeah.
He's just retired from pulpit ministry at the
Uh-huh.
age of 90.
Wow.
But he really taught me a lot about how to open up the scriptures. And, uh, his expositional preaching was dynamic and powerful. And
Hmm.
I always loved that. So, you Stephen Nichols, I really
Hmm.
appreciate. He's the president of Reformation Bible College.
Yeah.
My personal mentor, besides RC, was D. James Kennedy.
Okay.
Dr. Kennedy is now in heaven, but
Hmm.
Dr. Kennedy had me on his staff for a few years, and I got to be a part of a number of initiatives of his ministry to
Hmm.
care for the poor, pro life work. We started Knox Theological Seminary together. So it was, great privilege. So I dearly love Dr. Kennedy's work as well.
We started Knox Theological Seminary.
Well,
You
it was
was a part of
Dr.
that.
Kennedy. Yeah, Dr. Kennedy started it, but I was the person who wrote the first catalog and pulled
What?
together the initial ideas to present to the board and helped to lay out the plans for the library and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Wow, I did not know that. I just learned that today. That's crazy. So, who are some of the authors all time who are like that you would say are your maybe top five or your favorite, authors to read from, or even some of your books that you like reading, that you liked reading?
Yeah, I mean, my theological heroes include R.C. and Sinclair Ferguson, but
Hmm.
further back, obviously Luther and Calvin, Pierre
Hmm.
Viret, the great magisterial reformers. Thomas Chalmers
Mm-hmm.
is probably the theologian that I have the most academic interest in,
Mm-hmm.
and great Scottish Reformed reformer. I really love Charles Haddon Spurgeon, and I
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
read Spurgeon all day long. John
Mm-hmm.
R.W. Stott, I love. J.I. Packer, Ian Murray.
Mm-hmm.
Francis Schaeffer had a
Mm-hmm.
huge impact on my thinking and on my life, and I still go back to his books regularly. So,
Mm. Yeah. So I mean, you're super busy. Like, what do you do for leisure, and how do you incorporate rest?
well, if you ask anybody, they would immediately say, "Well, George's biggest hobby is reading,"
Mm-hmm.
which is true. I love to read and love
Yeah.
collecting old books and all of that. But I love to run. I love
Mm, okay.
I do. You used to do a lot of 5Ks and marathons. That's slowed down a little bit with my age, but I still love to run. And
Mm-hmm.
this summer, the pastors and I are going to do this uttermost thing. So we're gonna run a
Oh,
lot of miles with that.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
love good food, and my wife and I love to travel, and
Okay. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's good.
so we used to live out in a place where we could do a lot of gardening. We
Okay.
don't do as much gardening now. We a couple of years ago moved. We downsized. We had this farm and a lot of acreage, and we it was just getting too much for me to manage, and so we've downsized. But we used to
Okay.
love to garden, and we still have lots of flowers. The tulips and the narcissus blooms are all out right now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Good. 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 So, what advice can you give me in particular? Uh, I mean, to be specific, in my journey as a scholar, I do currently attend Knox Theological Seminary. And I didn't know you were a part of the beginning stages of establishing that institution. I'm going for my master's in Christian and Classical Studies. I love this program thus far. It's a
yeah,
lot
it's a
of
great
reading.
it's
Yeah,
a great program.
it
I love it
is.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the best counsel that I can ever give to any classical Christian educator is stay curious, keep reading, try to avoid as much as possible doom scrolling on the internet, and just but the biggest thing is really love your wife,
Hmm.
love your children,
Mm-hmm.
cherish every moment, and live life to the fullest, to the
Mm.
glory of God.
Amen. I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, great conversation. You did an outstanding job in really teaching me so many things that I didn't know about education and classical Christian education. You also have done a great job in just reaffirming the convictions I have in relation to a lot of things when it comes to classical Christian education, along with education. So, thank you for this blessing and opportunity to discuss this topic with you, and I appreciate you mightily.
Amen.
Yeah,
Well, I look forward to us talking again soon.
yeah, yeah. All right. And if
Bless
you're
you.
watching, um, thank you for tuning in to this video, and hopefully this is edifying to you as it has been to me. Take care.